When it comes to military uniforms and gear, oftentimes to improve upon, upgrade, or just make it work, various versions of the same item are seen over the course of years, with each iteration usually being better than the last. Sometimes, though, this isn't as cut and dry, as items can be removed or stop being issued only to return years later either exactly the same or changed a bit. One example of this was the US military's patrol cap, or field cap, which since 1943, but actually 1951, but actually 1981, but officially 2004, has graced the heads of not just US troops, but millions of others across the globe. Before diving into everything, it's probably a good idea to define what exactly a patrol cap is. Not officially called that until the 2000s, it was a nickname that caught on for a hat that can be defined almost as a soft kepi mixed with elements of a baseball cap. The top of the hat is flat and oval in shape, with straight sides leading to a reinforced band around its edge, with the back portion slightly taller than the front, though not always, with a simple, usually stiffened front visor. Now, as said before, this cap wasn't something that came overnight, as far as design and trial and error goes. In fact, its origins, or at least elements of its design, can be seen in various pieces of headwear dating as far back as the 1800s, and wasn't quite as steady one leads into another type situation, meaning there are technically a few different starting points, but to get the full picture we sort of have to take a brief look at an abridged history of US field caps from the mid-1800s onwards at least. With the US Armed Forces being founded in 1775 at the onset of the Revolutionary War, the Army, Marine Corps, and Navy have gone through quite a few pieces of headwear, often following trends of the time usually established by European nations, specifically that of France. It really wouldn't be until the turn of the 20th century did the US begin to steer a bit away from them. But before then, one of the more common forms of hats were kepis. Created by the French, these essentially were shorter, rigid hats that bore a circular top, straight sides, and a visor. However, as they quickly spread, they began to be seen in a variety of styles and sizes. When it came to the United States, they too fielded these caps, as well as others which bore similar characteristics. Two prime examples of this were the Model 1858 Forage and the informally named McClellan cap, both of which were notably worn or helped to inspire other caps from the American Civil War onwards. But as the 20th century approached, these kepi-style caps began to be refined, essentially moving away from the more ornate and in some cases impractical to one that in a way can be considered the missing link between the kepi and patrol cap, the M1895 Forage cap. This hat, which sort of vaguely retains some of the design elements of the kepi while also leaning more towards a pillbox style cap, simplified the look as it generally was less rigid and, for a lack of a better term, awkward due to its flatter, oval, and overall more uniform crown, which saw its sides shrink but also stay equal around its entire length. That in turn provided better protection from the elements while allowing for a more fitting and comfortable wearing experience. Now, it's worth mentioning that because of the changes to warfare during this time, headwear, and really uniforms by and large, were becoming less intricate, flashy, and formal, and instead moving towards more muted, utilitarian, and practical. The M1895 could be considered a design that came from this trend. However, as early as the 1850s, similar designs were already being fielded, specifically forage caps worn by certain British regiments, which has led some to believe that they helped to influence, if not completely mold, the 1895 shape. But regardless of all that, the final form of the cap led to a bit of pushback and criticism, as its design was seen by many, mostly officers and higher-ups, as being too basic as well as uninteresting, with some describing it as conspicuously barren of military smartness and a cross between a bicycle cap and a car conductor's cap. This reference came mainly due to the overall design sharing similarities to other hats used by the general public, such as baseball players and conductors, in the years prior, meaning it was well known by many, but also due to that it had some disappointed with its adoption. Eventually, this cap would be done away with, being replaced by a hat which had more or less been around in some way, shape, or form for decades: the campaign hat. Seen in a variety of styles and variations, these hats would become synonymous with US troops during the early 1900s into World War I and through the 1920s, with really the closest hat in design to the patrol being a secondary one introduced in 1907. Referred to as the M1907 Winter Cap, these took a similar design method, granted with the inclusion of a retractable side and ear flaps that would cover the wearer's head and lower face, being tied off at the bottom. From its top, you can see that it is sort of flat, but is also designed to fold flat. Coupled with the crown portion jutting out a bit, you can also notice the inspiration, giving it more of a look akin to ski or mountain caps introduced by Austria-Hungary in the 1860s, which then caught on with many Germanic and Nordic countries in the decades after. That being said, this cap and its subsequent revisions and variations, with the biggest one being the M1937, which updated the shape of the flaps and securing method, was utilized by a few departments and entities into the 1940s. Though these winter caps in a way were the closest thing to a patrol cap at the time, they were sparsely seen during the war from a general perspective, as they weren't exactly standard issue to all troops. Obviously though, they did often appear in more constant cold and snowy areas and fronts such as the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Due to their overall shape being pretty close to the German M43 field cap, it's been said that their use was limited in part because of that, but whatever the case, the lack of a field cap would change though with the introduction of two uniform systems, the HBT or Herringbone Twill Utility and the M1943 combat uniforms. Before the outbreak of hostilities, the US military was not the most modern one out there, with a rather small force and utilizing either obsolete or somewhat impractical elements, with one such example being the Army's M1937 blue denim work uniform. Being something of a predecessor to the HBTs, it was utilitarian for work and more physical duties, while accompanying khaki uniforms were worn during the summer for other purposes, both of which featured different style caps, neither being ones close to field or patrol. When the clouds of war loomed, many started to realize that modernization was necessary and things began to kick into high gear, and when it came to uniforms, 1941 brought out the HBTs, which replaced the blue denim, while also becoming something of a general purpose one for many troops in all theaters of the war. Now, throughout the war, these would see variations, revisions, and updates, but more or less the components remain the same: a set of trousers, a jacket, and a hat, of which there were two. The first being referred to as the Daisy May, which was a clam digger style one that had been carried over from the denim uniform. These were eventually phased out as the second, which was initially for mechanized forces but slowly extended into mechanical, and then outwards, was a visored one simply referred to as Cap HBT, and then the color shade, this one being Olive Drab 7, or OD for short. When looking at it, you can see in a way it almost resembles a shortened patrol cap, but more so a Marine Corps utility cover, as it has 8 points around it. Both would technically be true, as this cap in a way helped lead to the creation of both, and was actually used by both Marines and soldiers. Though the shape is reminiscent of the M1895 forage cap, it's actually one that was something of a step forward from it. As mentioned, those types of caps became popular due to general use, like in sports such as baseball, or by laborers, with one big one being railway workers. Because of this, over time, these caps started to change, being modified or altered to help improve its functionality and comfort for more extensive activities. A good example of this was the George Cromer cap. Designed by him, a former baseball player turned railway engineer, and sewn by his wife Ida, it would help lead to the eventual famous railway caps, which appear almost identical to these HBT ones, as they too featured a band around the crown's edge for a more secure fit, along with the points around them too for better reinforcement. But anyway, these caps, or rather the designs for them, were chosen as they had already proven to be good for intensive work duties and saw a few differences such as color, cloth material, vent hole count, and visor length during their lifetimes. Worn initially by the Army and some Marines, eventually the design would be altered slightly into the P-44 Marine cap, which changed up some minor things, leading to the eventual utility cover. The thing to note about this cap though was its lightweight and semi-breathability, meaning it was good for work and general wear, but mostly in temperate and warmer environments, meaning it wasn't suitable for colder ones. Though there were a few types used by forces around the various theaters, one of the most go-to ones for general wear, be it warmer or colder, was the knit cap, sometimes referred to as the Jeep cap. However, the focus on creating a more proper combat system that took everything, updated it, and sort of unified it was in the works, which meant a new cap as well. That came in the form of the M1943 uniform, developed to fulfill two roles, the first to be more of a combat uniform rather than a utility one, with the second to replace various specialty but also problem-ridden uniforms and components. Experiments began in 1942, seeing a few different variations. Brought on partially by this project, but also the need of an all-purpose field cap, an already existing one was used as a basis. Was it one of the aforementioned ones? Nope, it was actually another specialty, lesser-seen winter hat, known as the ski cap. Based off a design of a commercially available hat, it was issued primarily to units operating in colder climates or trained for them, such as the 10th Mountain Division, and was made in two versions. The first included a buckle securing strap similar to the ones seen with the M1937s, while the second did away with it while also adding vent eyelets on the sides. Aside from that, their overall styling deviated a bit from the M1907 and 37s in that its retractable sides were cut down quite a bit, really extending far enough down to cover the ears rather than the whole face, while also having a much smaller profile. As its crown was a wider dome shape that also removed the flat fold design, it sported a much more pronounced and stiffened visor, and featured more reinforced sections of paneling which saw a central stitch from front to back, and two more on either side which met in the back intersecting with the central. When the M1943 field cap was finalized as the Cap Field Cotton OD with visor, you can see how it took many of the elements of the ski cap, but also seemingly the HBT cap too. From the ski cap, the stiffened visor was brought over, as was the retractable flap, but instead of the whole inside being lined with wool, only the flap was. Additionally, the paneling and stitch work was simplified, seeing the left and right stitches forming a full loop between the top and sides rather than terminating at the visor, while the middle was mostly done away with, seeing only a shortened section at the back going the full length, as well as a smaller one between the top and the reinforced band, which appeared to have been carried over from the HBT cap, which again allowed for a more proper and secure fit. Finally, the flatter top and vent holes, at least size-wise, appear to have been lifted from them too. Lastly, the angle of the cap became slightly more pronounced from the front to back, as this specific one's back is measured at 3.5 inches, or about 8.9 centimeters, while its front is 2.25 inches, or just over 5.7 centimeters. Again, like the HBTs, there were some slight variations such as color shades, vent eyelet count, and visor dimensions, with these between initial issuing in 1943 and their eventual replacement a few years later. Though they were closer to being a standard issue general purpose field cap, they often were employed for colder weather uniforms, though were something of a step forward, with a much bigger one happening with their replacement, the M1951 field cap. As hostilities began to break out on the Korean Peninsula, with the North invading the South in 1950, the United States and UN forces quickly dispatched troops, leading to open conflict that lasted for 3 years. During that time, the US began to field the M1951, which essentially used the M1943 but updated a few elements and refined others, while leaning its purpose more towards a general one. A part of this was a hat which looked and was designed almost the same as the M1943. When looking at one, you can see it bore details and elements that were nearly identical save for a few minor things. Its shade changing to OG 107, which would be the go-to color for many field and utility uniforms and components for the next few decades, the removal of the vent eyelets on the sides, and the visor dimensions altering slightly while also seeing reinforced stitching. During its time, it more or less became the intended general-purpose cap the M1943 set out to be, as it could be worn in most environments and temperatures, as well as with other pieces of headwear such as the M1 helmet. Because of this, it also began to actually be used a bit more in combat, usually by specialty forces who were out on reconnaissance, scouting, and wait for it, patrols. This in turn led to the cap being worn by Army Rangers, who started referring to them as patrol caps, which sort of stuck as their unofficial name. Now, as with other caps and certain items, these patrol caps were very favorable by troops, but some officers found them somewhat unprofessional and not quite sharp enough, as they had a tendency to sag, wrinkle, and appear improper after prolonged use and washing. The solution to this came not long after, when Army Chief of Staff General Matthew B. Ridgway passed a policy in 1953 stating soldiers had to put an active effort into appearing more soldierly by starch and pressing their uniforms while also adding stiffeners to their caps. Because there was no standard method for doing this being employed, different takes on it were observed. However, it did inevitably lead to commercially available versions springing up that had stiffened sides and edging, removing the need for one to do this. These caps would soon gain the common name of Ridgway caps due to the general, but also because of their overall shape and features, they gained a few different nicknames such as Coffee Can, Spring Up, as one of the more popular companies that produced them called their version that, and later on even Elvis cap due to singer Elvis Presley being photographed a few times while wearing one during his time in the Army. Though they were never officially issued items, they more or less served the same purpose as the M1951, and as such a variety of types were seen, with differences in features such as cloth thickness, different vent eyelet counts on the sides, and sometimes the omission of the retractable ear flap. Though both continued to be worn in the 1960s and seen throughout Vietnam and Southeast Asia, it soon became clear that both caps had some shortcomings when it came to laundering, maintenance, and overall appearance. The stiffened design of the Ridgways proved problematic when it came to safely washing, as they could be easily damaged or deformed, while the M1951s could easily wrinkle and scrunch up, resulting in both requiring unnecessary amounts of care. So what was the solution? The hot weather field cap. With tensions rising in Southeast Asia, it seemed more and more likely the US presence there was going to increase. From the 1950s through the mid-60s, the few US troops in Vietnam were primarily observing, advising, and training. Because of their specialty roles, many had a bit more freedom when it came to choice of uniforms, leading to an assortment of headwear, with the M1951 and Ridgways remaining somewhat popular. This eventually saw them landing in the hands of many South Vietnamese troops. However, by 1964, the Ridgway cap and, to a slightly lesser extent, the M1951s, which continued to be worn by certain specialty forces such as Army Rangers, were phased out and replaced with a new cap known as the hot weather or utility cap. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, leading to the US presence in Vietnam skyrocketing by a factor of 8 by the end of the following year, troops poured into the country, many of whom were wearing the utility uniforms first introduced during the Korean War, often referred to as the OG-107 after their color shade designation. It wasn't long, though, until it became evident that they were less than adequate for jungle warfare, eventually leading to the development of the TCUs, or Tropical Combat Uniforms. Though the Army was in a state of flux when it came to uniforms overall, trying to fulfill the need of not only modernizing branch-wide but also meeting requirements for jungle warfare, they eventually landed on a newly designed hat which came in a more common and familiar shape, all while allowing for better ventilation and comfort for the environment. At least that was the intention. Years in the making, the utility cap, officially known as the Cap Field Hot Weather OG-106, its design was essentially that of a baseball-style one in that it was composed of 6 panels making up its crown, each of which had a single vent hole stitched towards the top portion, a simple 2-stitch reinforced brim, while on the inside saw a cloth sweatband and mesh reinforced stiffener embedded into the front 2 panels above the visor. Finally, the material was a mix of rayon, gabardine, and polyester, which allowed them to be washed very easily while also maintaining their stiffened and sharp appearance. When these hats made their way to troops around 1963 to 64, the positive sentiment wasn't quite shared. As though the vents were there, the intense heat of Vietnam saw wearers sweat right through the polyester bands, leading to staining from not only the salt in the sweat, but also dirt and debris from the terrain, which was seen not only on the inside, but out as well. To add to this, because they were issued branch-wide, those fighting in the war, notably Special Forces units, were reluctant to wear them as they felt it diminished their appearance overall. Additionally, due to its design and stiffeners, these gained unfavorable nicknames such as the beanie, but also pinhead caps, as the front panels would deform and appear more pointed than intended. To fix some of these issues, the second version of this hat, introduced in 1969, was made, which more or less just removed the vent holes in the front 2 panels, while also cutting down the length of the stiffeners, terminating them around the area where they would usually frequently bend, as seen here. As for the sweating and staining issue, a synthetic leather liner was added, however only with the third version, which was actually the first of a new uniform, the Cap Hot Weather OG-507, which was the final iteration of the utility uniform known as the OG-507 in permanent press uniform. It is also worth noting that there was also a scarcely seen 6-color desert version of the cap made in the late 70s, which actually marked one of the first instances of a field cap being printed in a camouflage pattern, but to find out more about that, you can check out our 6-color desert uniform reference guide video, link to which can be found at the end. Anyway though, these caps would stick around in one way, shape, or form until roughly the mid-1980s, as they would eventually be replaced by the cap that they had replaced. The 1970s saw quite a few different uniforms, as it was a period seeing a mix of ones, or at least elements of them, introduced either before or because of the Vietnam War. Coupled with further testing and experiments with designs, in 1981 a new standardized field uniform would be adopted, the Battle Dress Uniform, or BDU for short. Overall, these were seen positively for a few reasons, as they were essentially adopted by all branches while replacing all previous field uniforms too. But not only that, as they were also seen as a step forward in design, while also being the first large-scale standard issue garments bearing camouflage patterns. Initially seeing 2 versions, the Type 1, which was printed with the woodland camouflage, and the Type 2 being a 6-color desert pattern, a cap, known simply as Cap Camouflage Pattern, was included, granted only in the woodland camouflage, at least initially. Seemingly seeing a few different versions tested in the years leading up to its adoption, the tried and true design as laid out by the M1943 and refined in the M1951 once again proved to be the best option, as the final version appears virtually identical to the M1951s, with the only real differences coming down to three things: the camouflage print, the fabric being a water-repellent 80% cotton and 20% nylon, and the height dimensions being slightly larger in its rear, extending to 3.75 inches or a little over 9.5 centimeters. However, as the early BDUs proved to be a bit too heat-absorbing and retaining due to their fabric being made up of nylon cotton twill, eventually a second version of the cap would be seen, the Cap Hot Weather. This version, like the Hot Weather BDUs, were made of 50/50 nylon cotton ripstop, but in addition removed the ear flaps while also adding 6 metal eyelets on the sides for improved ventilation. Additionally, the front vertical stitch between the reinforced band and top was removed, and the height of the hat's back was decreased slightly. Now, this is where things get a little confusing, as there were a few changes beyond this as far as nomenclature and camouflage patterns. By and large, these two versions were the primary ones: a temperate one with flaps for more mild and colder weather, and a hot weather one which was, well, for hot weather. However, there was another which seems logical in one way but not quite another. This is the Cap Camouflage Pattern Class 2, which was essentially the initial temperate woodland design but printed with the 3-color desert. Virtually identical to its woodland counterpart, its only difference was the tag inside and its name of Class 2, as Class 1 was given to the woodland. However, later models of the same cap sometimes also show a tag stating it's Class 1, though its NATO stock numbers are still associated with Class 2. Interestingly, there were never any hot weather caps produced with the 3-color desert camouflage, nor were there any patrol caps of any kind officially made in the 6-color desert. Anyway, these versions would become synonymous with the BDU uniform system and its subsequent revisions and additions, so much so that they would sometimes be referred to as the BDU patrol cap or just BDU cap, and would have a lasting mark on not only the US military but many others around the world, as the BDU became one of the most used and replicated designs out there, but we'll talk a bit about that a little later on. As far as the United States' usage though, these would continue to be worn by branches through the early 2000s when they were replaced by the patrol cap. For real this time though. With the turn of the millennia, the US military as a whole determined it was again time to update and modernize their uniforms, and coupled with branch identity becoming a major thing for whatever reason, a plethora of not only uniform cuts but also camouflages were made, with literally every branch either in the process of designing or already rolling out new unique uniforms. The patrol cap was once again at the front and center as far as general use headwear. By and large, the most patrol cap-centric branch was obviously the Army, with its newly designed universal camouflage pattern printed on their ACUs, or Army Combat Uniform, which included their now tried-and-true design for a cap, but with a few changes done to them. These caps, for the first time, were officially designated as patrol caps and remained from a general standpoint the same, except now they were all 50/50 Nyko ripstop, the eyelets were completely removed, the vertical front stitch above the visor returned, the back, which was shortened to 3.25 inches or about 8.25 centimeters, saw the inclusion of a hook and loop strip for wearers to attach their name tape, a much stiffer visor, and perhaps most interestingly, a map pocket on the inside, which over the following years was used and abused to varying extents. With the ACUs rolling out in 2004, these marked the first technical time patrol caps were a thing, as all previous iterations were only referred to as that. But if you're keen on US camouflages, you know what's going to happen with UCP. However, before that, let's pop over to the Navy and Air Force and see how things are doing over there. First up is the Air Force, as in 2006 they began issuing their ABU, or Airman Battle Uniform, which saw early experimental versions fielded in 2003 bearing a bluish urban tiger stripe camouflage on a uniform that was very reminiscent of the BDU. The biggest talk of it was the inclusion of a cap that appeared almost identical to the Marine Corps utility cover, leaving some confused and others somewhat annoyed. Ultimately, the decision to adopt the camo and the cover was ditched, with the final version being a digital tiger stripe in the same color scheme as UCP, as well as a hat that was much more in line with the patrol. Known as the Cap Utility Camouflage Pattern Air Force, it was almost an exact copy of the Army's UCP patrol cap, with the only differences, apart from the camo, being 4 stitched vent holes on the sides, the absence of the front vertical stitch, rear hook and loop strip and pocket, and less stiff visor, and it being made of 50/50 nylon cotton twill, as first-generation ABUs were made of that material. This would change though a few years later, as airmen mentioned excessive overheating and sweating while stationed in arid locations. This led to ripstop uniforms replacing them around 2011 or so, with the only change apart from the cloth being its designation, which was now Cap Utility Air Force. Finally came the Navy, which saw perhaps the most public-facing trials when it came to new uniforms, as they had the TFU, or Task Force Uniform, which was split up into 4 different versions, being the Navy Working Uniform, or NWU, A, B, C, and D, each of which had its own camouflage pattern. 2 were digital and 2 were recolored woodland, with the differences between each being either blue or gray dominant in shade, as well as uniform features. 2 of these, A and B, saw utility-style covers referred to in official media as an 8-point cover, while the other 2, C and D, had patrol-style or round-top covers. Here are the 2 round-top covers, which are exactly the same as one another and referred to as Experimental Garment NWU C and D cap camouflage pattern. They more or less follow the most basic features of the patrol caps and closely resembled the M1951 design, minus the ear flaps. Testing on these lasted from 2004 until 2005, with the blue dominant pixelated design printed on the more modern 2-chest pocket pointed collar uniform, with the 8-point cover being selected, officially bringing the patrol cap's use in the Navy to an end. That brings us back to the Army and their UCP. As the war in Afghanistan was raging, soldiers began to complain that their camouflage was ineffective but also dangerous, as it wasn't quite universal in that it really didn't blend much into anything at all. Seeing this on display in a pretty damaging news report, the Army began a series of testing and trials to adopt a new camouflage pattern, but as a stopgap in 2010, rolled out ACUs in a pattern called Operation Enduring Freedom Camouflage Pattern, OEFCP for short, which was essentially multicam to soldiers participating in Operation Enduring Freedom, thus the name. Naturally, the patrol cap was updated to reflect the change too, as they were seen alongside them until a new permanent pattern was selected, which came in the form of Scorpion W2, a slightly altered version of multicam seeing minor differences in the pattern shapes and color shades. Officially beginning issue in 2015, this pattern, designated OCP or Operational Camouflage Pattern, was also seen on the patrol cap. When lined up against the UCP version, the only real changes were the height of the back, which reverted to the 3.5 inches or 8.9 centimeters. However, there are a few particular things about the both of these worth noting. Put side by side, they seem almost identical unless you really scrutinize them. The easiest way to tell which is OEFCP, or multicam, features both vertical as well as horizontal shapes, while OCP just has horizontal. But to make things a little bit more confusing is that tags on some caps, at least in the early years, are incorrect. For example, these two. They both say OCP Patrol Cap, are both the same size yet have 2 different NATO stock numbers. When they're looked up, one is listed as OEFCP Patrol Cap while the other is OCP Patrol Cap. It seems that even early on, manufacturers were getting the two mixed up, or maybe using leftover stock or cutting corners between contracts. Additionally, sometimes OCP caps will have their hook and loop name tape strip removed on the back, as stitching tapes, rank, and other patches and insignia began to be allowed again. Anyway though, OEFCP's wear-out date was October 2018, while UCP's came a year later, after which all that was left was OCP. To add to all this, the Air Force eventually dropped their ABU and Digital Tiger Stripe, adopting OCP ACUs as their standard field uniform in 2018, fully switching over in 2021, while the Space Force, which was established in 2019, adopted it too shortly after, making the patrol cap associated with 3 of the 6 branches. But that pretty much brings us to the present, and granted this covered more or less all of the main instances of patrol caps, there are likely still a few other limited use or experimental ones out there, like this Air Force Wear Test Style B cap, which look to have been made to refine or improve the ABU at some point. That being said though, the patrol cap's usage outside of the United States is quite substantial, with commercial, media, and other countries' armed forces. The patrol style cap has been around for decades now, and because of this has been a lasting influence on a number of different outlets. Staying within the US military, other hats have been seen which share their general shape and features, granted usually a tad altered, though on a more limited basis, such as the Cap Field Heavy or Intermediate Cold Weather A2 caps, for example. However, it's really outside the US Armed Forces is this really the case. Since the introduction of the M1951, commercial versions have been made, with them initially being aimed at troops for private purchase, with the best and most obvious example being the Ridgway cap. However, that didn't last long, as soon after they would make their way to the public for costumes and casual wear. In no time, it became synonymous with 1950s era US soldiers, used by foreign countries like South Vietnam, and even worn by individuals such as Fidel Castro. Granted, over time his slowly morphed back into ones closer to the patrol cap. However, since the battle dress uniform was introduced, this has expanded exponentially, as the uniform, hat included, has been seen in numerous iterations sporting all sorts of colors and camouflage patterns. Because of this and its long-standing association with the US military, it's been seen by millions, if not billions, and as such has been the go-to for decades when it comes to military field caps. In media, be it based on or inspired by true events or uniforms to fictional ones, it's been seen in video games like The Last of Us, movies such as Avatar, to TV shows like Stargate SG-1, to name a few. The cap is almost always the one forces wear, at least in a contemporary setting. Outside of commercial and fictional depictions, though, the hat has extended around to various militaries, and though there are all sorts of headwear fielded by armed forces around the world, arguably the patrol cap, or some slight variation of it, looks to have become one of the most prevalent, as versions range from exact copies, be they the classic with the retractable ear flaps, more modern without, or something in between. These seemingly were often initially paired with copies of the BDU, as that too was seen as a standard for many years, but even as nations upgraded and reinvented their looks, the patrol cap often stayed after the fact. From South America to Africa, Asia to Europe, and even the reaches of Oceania, the cap has appeared, with ones being associated with clones and copies of older uniform ensembles, to others connected to new and unique native designs. The patrol cap has reached far and wide. Having a rather long history with roots dating back to the kepis and forage hats of the mid-1800s or so, the patrol cap has had quite a long and interesting history for a number of reasons. Something of a simple hat with its rounded flat top, straight sides, and slightly angled design from front to back, it took ideals and concepts of caps from a few years to decades before it, and over the course of 50 years or so refined it into a standard field cap of many of the branches of the US military and others around the world. Seeing various start and stop dates, as well as features and official designations, the patrol cap has in of itself become its own style of hat, and because of its evident ease of wear and apparent effectiveness, has spread across the world and morphed into all sorts of variations for numerous forces and purposes. But hopefully this video covering its origins and basic evolution, not to mention some hats which replaced and or influenced them, has been interesting and helpful to some. If you enjoyed it, perhaps leave a like and subscribe if you haven't gotten around to it yet. If not, that's okay. Just be sure to check back in the near future for more of the history of, right here on Uniform History.